Welcome to Tanach Study and to Sefer Study. I'm Nachliel Selavan, and you're watching another episode of Archaeology Snapshot on Sefer Micha, the sixth book of Trei Assar, the small prophets, or the 12. And speaking of numbers, there's four things which we intend to cover in each one of these episodes, and these are the four questions, which is when is it happening, who are the main players, where are they located, with some highlights from history and archaeology. Now that we got that out of the way, I'm going to go back to the number 4, because Micha is actually the fourth of four different prophets, Arba'a Nevi'im Shenib'u Beperek Echad. There are four prophets who prophesied, that's the proper way of saying it, not prophesized, and that's why Spellcheck is going to always say that prophesize is wrong. So four prophets, Nevi'im, who prophesied in the same period of time. So who are these? Well, we have Hosea, Amos, Yeshayahu, and Micha. Now, there's a lot of similarities between them, not only in terms of the topic which they're dealing with, which mostly has to do with Assyria and the moral decadence of the kingdom of Israel, Shomron, Israel, as well as many problems in Yehuda, Yerushalayim, in the kingdom of Yehuda. But there are a lot of metaphors and linguistic similarities, grammatical similarities, and common references that they all use, to the point that many scholars actually debate which came first. Is one copying from the other? Are they copying from somewhere else? And there is a scholarly discussion or debate as to which one of these prophets said it first and who is quoting who. Sometimes there are similarities to verses in Divrei Hayamim, in Tehillim, not only between these four. And so this is a very broad conversation. If you really want an exhaustive discussion and comparative analysis of it, I recommend seeing the introduction to Da'at Mikra. But suffice it to say that when we hear a cultural reference that we all know, it's a lot easier for us to accept an idea. So, for example, in modern Israeli music, when there's a reference to Tanach, for example, then you get it like, oh, he's using a word that we know from Tanach and they're making a spin off it, right? So they kind of make sense. My point is that when there is a common cultural database that everyone is using, it's a lot easier to make an impact. So I'm just suggesting, without getting into too much detail, that perhaps the fact that these Nevi'im were in the same period, they knew each other, they can be building on top of what each other was saying to further the impact. So comes along Micha, who is the last, or the youngest actually, the last of these Arba Nevi'im, and he is accounting on the fact that you already heard Hosea, and you heard Amos, and you heard Yeshayahu. Now you're going to hear Micha, so he doesn't need to go into that much detail about things that we've already mentioned exhaustively. That's just as an overview. So, as the Navi says, Micha prophesied during the reign of Yotam, Achaz, and Chizkiyahu. Now, one of the ways we know he's the youngest and he's the latest chronologically is because Hosea was already prophesying in the time of Uzziyahu earlier on. And Amos and Yeshayahu also deal with Uzziyahu and Yotam and Achaz. Some say that you can take these prophets earlier to Yerovam HaSheni, some of them. So the point is that Micha comes last. But in terms of the order of the Trei Assar, Micha is coming after Yonah, which talks about the Nevuah, about the destruction of Nineveh, and before Nahum, and Nahum talks about the actual destruction of Nineveh. So he's right there in between, because Micha actually talks about the destruction of Nineveh and the fact that those who destroy us are going to eventually be destroyed. So it's kind of connected in a certain way. Now, in terms of the topic, while the previous Nevi'im talk a lot about Avodah Zarah and also about moral issues, Micha barely mentions Avodah Zarah, very, very little. Most of his discussion has to do with corruption, with moral decadence, with social problems. So, for example, he talks about cheating in business and people who are hungry for money and people who are selling out their own people, separating mothers from their children and making them into slaves. And so the midah keneged midah, the measure for measure, is that they themselves will be ripped apart from their family unit and will be taken into galut, into exile, which is the ultimate punishment. And so that is kind of the overview of the kind of things that Micha is talking about, mostly about the problems morally in Shomron and in Yerushalayim, in the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Yehuda, and he's warning about their destruction. And indeed we see echoes to the stories that we've seen and we've covered in previous episodes, whether it's Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, or Melachim, which we've covered. I'll put some links in the description so that you can follow up. You can go back, because I'm not going to go into things we've already discussed at length, but that has to do with the destruction by Assyria, by Sancheriv, as well as later on we talk about about Nebuchadnezzar and Bavel and the Al Yehuda documents. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to put the link to the previous videos in the description. So make sure before you scroll down there to hit that like button, because that like button, ladies and gentlemen, does a very important thing. First of all, it keeps the video afloat so that it suggests it to other people who like similar topics. So the moment you hit like, YouTube's going to say, you know what? I think other people might also like this video. And it's very important to do that. Number two, I'm going to really appreciate that. So smash that like button, give that thumbs up. Now let's move on to our next topic, which is Micha himself. Who is he? Where does he come from? Micha is mentioned as Micha HaMorashti. Now, what exactly is Morashti? The main suggestion is that he comes from Moreshet Gat. Now, Micha opens up talking about many different places, and if you go through these places, I'm just going to read a whole bunch of them while you look at them on the map. So these places are mostly in the southern Judean hills as well as in the west towards the coast. So there's Gat, there's Tza'anan, there's Marot, there's Lachish, there's Achziv, Maresha, Adulam, etc., etc. Now, you see Yerushalayim here, so you have kind of the idea of where we're located. And there's many other of these places that he mentions. He's local from the southern Judean hills. He is from Mamlechet Yehuda, pretty much at its highest point before Assyria comes in the time of Achaz and makes it into a vassal. We've spoken about that at length. A vassal kingdom, like a puppet kingdom. I'm going to mention two important cities here in this conversation. Number one is Moreshet Gat. Number two is Lachish. You know what? Let's start with Lachish. So you see Lachish here on the bottom left. So this is a very important city. We've spoken exhaustively at great length in several episodes of Sefer Study. All of them have to do with Assyria and Babylon. Okay? So Lachish was destroyed by Sancheriv, and it was later destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. We have the Lachish reliefs in the British Museum. We have the Lachish letters also in the British Museum, but from the time of the destruction of the first temple. Right? So we have Lachish, and then we have Moreshet Gat. Now, the reason it's called Moreshet Gat is because it's next to Gat. So you see Gat Plishtim, right? That's what we have here on the top left, known today as Tel Mikne, not the modern city of Gat, which is named after a misidentification of ancient Gat, biblical Gat. Anyway, so Moreshet Gat, there are two suggestions as to where it is. It's either Tel Jadide or Tel Burna, which are each 2.5 kilometers either to the east or to the west of Beit Guvrin. So we're talking not far from Beit Shemesh. This is all in the southern Judean hills, a little off to the west. Okay, let's start with Lachish. So I've mentioned Lachish many times, so I'm only going to say briefly, amidst the backdrop of this picture of Lachish, that Lachish is a very important biblical site, and you should visit Tel Lachish. It's being built up right now, and I think that while admission is free, you should go and get it because it looks like they're going to turn it into a national park that you're going to have to pay to go into instead of a free national park. But anyway, I'm going to put a lot of information about that in the description, so make sure to read the show notes. What you're seeing here in the picture is a beautiful display by the Iron Age fortress. In other words, the fortress which is relevant to the story of Chizkiyahu and Tzidkiyahu. And that is a fortress that has in front of it a modern display with the chairs representing all of the kings of Yehuda from David HaMelech all the way to Tzidkiyahu, the last king of Yehuda, with the back of their chair representing how many years they ruled. So the higher the back of the chair, the longer they ruled. So that's a very fun thing to see. But now let's talk about Tel Jadide, or Moreshet Gat. So first of all, we've mentioned the Byzantine period Madaba map, Mapat Medva, which is biblical Medva, which is mentioned in Nachalat Reuven. We're talking about the Transjordan. And at the bottom of this church is a fragmented map of the Holy Land. Remember that in the time of the Byzantine Empire, which is when the eastern part of the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, so Israel became important to Christians, to the Roman Empire, which is now Christian. So they made a miniature model, so to speak, of the Holy Land because it's an important thing. You know, here's a model of the Holy Land, just like today we have maps of Israel in every classroom. So that's an important thing. Now, this map is a very important source for the study of locations in Eretz Israel in the 5th and 6th century. In other words, in the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud in the Byzantine period. Now, I'm going to highlight this area which mentions Moreshet Gat, and it actually writes on it. You're seeing it right here. I'm highlighting the area that you're seeing, that this is Moreshet Gat, the place of Micha HaMorashti. Now, there is a Byzantine church here that has not yet been found, even though several excavations have tried to identify it based on the Madaba map. But my professor at Bar-Ilan University, Boaz Zissu, took us to Tel Judeda, where he excavated extensively, even though he focuses more on the Roman Byzantine period. He's a world-renowned expert on burial chambers and caves, such as the Bar-Kokhba caves and so on, but also Mishnaic period burial. So he's an expert on this topic. There's a lot of great videos that he put out there on YouTube, Boaz Zissu. You know what? How about if I put one in the description just so you get a taste of what we're talking about? He put out many articles, and he's a very lovely professor. I enjoyed his class very much last semester, and he took us out to Tel Judeda. So there on the left is Professor Boaz Zissu. I chose pictures where you don't see people's face. It's a lot easier during Corona where our faces were masked. Here is one of the burial chambers. We're talking about the late Roman period, Byzantine period. So we went underground into caves. It was a lot of fun. It's a beautiful place. You get the sight of what it was like to live in biblical Israel, in Eretz Yisrael during this time, Malchut Yehuda. You see terraces, olive groves, all kinds of fruit trees and vegetation. It's a beautiful place to go. So that's Tel Judeda, which is probably where Micha is from, Micha Morashti, because this is probably biblical Moreshet Gat. So that's in terms of archaeology. Even though we don't know where the church is, the assumption is that if the church of Moreshet Gat was built there, and so one thing leads to another, we're assuming that that's where Moreshet Gat is. Anyway, let's move on to our last and final and exciting point. Micha, while he has a lot of tochecha, a lot of rebuke towards the corruption in Malchut Yisrael and Malchut Yehuda, and he talks about the destruction of Shomron, which we mentioned time and again in Yeshayahu. We spoke about it as well in Yirmiyahu, and we spoke about it in Melachim, and we spoke about it in several of the Trei Assar. He also talks about Geula, Nechama, consolation, as well as Acharit Hayamim, the end of days, which is why I call this consolation and culmination, the end of days. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of parallels and similarities between the way Micha talks about these concepts and how, for example, Yeshayahu talks about them, and even how later Yechezkel talks about them. So, for example, he talks about how Eretz Yisrael is going to be revived and is going to be repopulated with Bnei Yisrael in a similar way to that which Yechezkel describes as Arbe etchem ketzon Adam, ketzon Yerushalayim b'moadeh. It's like Yerushalayim is filled with people like sheep in Yerushalayim coming to the Moed to bring their korbanot. So there's some of these similarities in terms of the metaphor and in terms of the language. But after talking about the destruction, he says something which we would think is counterintuitive, but we've already seen this earlier on, even though it's later, in Yirmiyahu, which is basically saying that in Bavel we will survive. Uvat ad Bavel v'sham tinatzli. You will go to Bavel, and that's where you will be saved. And remember, we spoke about the Al Yahudu documents, which are documentations of the Jewish community in Bavel rebuilding their economy and their family and doing business. And that is a very important aspect of what Yirmiyahu talks about. Bnu batim vashevu nit'u ganot veichlu et piryan. We want you to invest in Bavel, not to sit there and wait to leave and to live on welfare, but rather to invest where you are, because that's how we're going to survive. So we see that aspect, but we also see something new where he says, Ki karnech asim barzel ufarsotayich asim nechusha. I'm going to make your horns like iron and your hooves like bronze. In other words, you are going to be able to fight back against your enemies. Now, here in this conversation, there are those Mefarshim who say that when he talks about the destruction of Ashur and Bavel, he's actually using them as a metaphor for something that's going to happen Atid Lavo in the days to come. In other words, he's using the powers that be, the superpowers of the ancient Near East, which is Assyria and Babylon at this time, because Egypt's already on the decline. And he uses that to refer to those nations which are going to come in the future. And then he talks about how lo yisa goy el goy cherev velo yimedu ad milchama. We're not going to fight and wage war against other nations anymore. Nations will be at peace. War is not going to be studied anymore. It's kind of like Star Trek, you know? We get rid of all of the disease and famine and wars, and now we go out to space and fight other wars with other aliens. No, I'm just kidding. But what's beautiful here is how he talks about Acharit Hayamim. So, first of all, the fact that he mentions these psukim describing Am Yisrael as coming back into Eretz Yisrael from all over, including Malchut Yisrael, who's dispersed in Eretz Ashur. As Yeshayahu says, Uvahu ha'uvdim me'eretz Ashur v'anidachim me'eretz Mitzrayim v'ishtachavu lehar Hashem b'Yerushalayim. Very similar, echoing the nevuot of Yeshayahu, saying that all of the diaspora is going to come back against all odds. And there are those who compare this to the most recent victories of Am Yisrael against many nations, which is very timely because we're about to celebrate Yom Yerushalayim, and that has to do with the Six-Day War, because that's when Yerushalayim was liberated. And we were fighting against several different nations. We were surrounded and tremendously outnumbered. And it was clear at the time that the victory that we had was min hashamayim. It was a miracle. I mean, you had people who had no regard for Torah and mitzvot, and they were writing Yisrael betach b'Hashem on their tanks. I mean, this was a watershed moment in Jewish history, the Six-Day War. And also we have the Yom Kippur War 6 years after that. We call it the 6 days and the 6 years, Sheshet Hayamim v'Sheshet Hashanim, but that's a story for another time. What I want to bring out here is that several of the nevuot that he brings, while echoing other than Nevi'im, are very unique, they're very special, and they really reflect or predict, that is, it's a prophecy, what is going on today. So for example, in Perek Daled, he says, V'haya be'acharit hayamim, this is going to be at the end of days, Yihye har bet Hashem nachon berosh he'arim, the mountain of God, referring to the Bet HaMikdash, but Yerushalayim is going to be at the top of all the other mountains, V'nisahu migvaot v'nharu elav amim, and many nations are going to come pouring into Jerusalem. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in prophetic times, in times in which Jerusalem, after being basically a place full of disease and a horrible living situation a mere 200 years ago, is now one of the most sought-after tourist locations in the whole world, visited by millions of people in the past few years. Jerusalem has never been a more attractive tourist site and a more beautiful place. So I'm showing you in the background from a YouTuber called Relaxing Walker, but I was just looking for Jerusalem today, and this is during Corona, so you're not really seeing a lot of people, but you're seeing that Yerushalayim has been built up and it's beautiful. So one example which I like to bring is the Mamilla Hotel. On the 8th floor, from the rooftop bar, you look at Yerushalayim, and I'm a native of the Old City. I have never seen a more stunning view of the Old City of Jerusalem than being on the top of the Mamilla Hotel at the rooftop bar. It's beautiful. It's breathtaking. And just imagine how much more is going to be when all of this construction is going to be done, even though the joke is Yerushalayim is always under construction. In fact, there's a funny story because my brother was once coming back from the army, and he called my sister, and my sister was like, "You must be in Jerusalem." And he was like, "How'd you know?" She said, "Oh, I hear construction in the background." So Yerushalayim is really being built, as we say, Yerushalayim tuvne b'tibaneh. It is being rebuilt at a tremendously expansive rate. It is incredible to watch. And Jerusalem is such a beautiful place to visit now. Why wouldn't you come to Jerusalem? We have universities, we have cafes, we have 9 West and the North Face. What else do you need? We even once had Kentucky Fried Chicken. Those Starbucks didn't really do too well here, and they tried twice. My point is that Yerushalayim is now this prophecy of people coming to Yerushalayim and Yerushalayim thriving. And so I want to end with this, with a publication which came out in Hebrew, and the OU is putting out one in English now as well, which is called Sefer HaNevuah. This is the Book of Prophecy. And the Book of Prophecy, which you can order online, I'm going to link to that in the description. It's a beautiful hardcover, heavy coffee table book. The English one is going to be further updated. They're making an updated version because there is more and more. It basically takes hard numbers, statistics, demographics, all kinds of charts, showing you one-to-one how many nevuot have predicted what is going on today against all odds. And we are talking about areas which have to do with military success, with demographics, with agriculture, with technology, with world recognition, with Nobel Prizes, all these incredible things that are happening in Eretz Yisrael and in Yerushalayim now. So I highly recommend that you check them out. You can check their website. They're really fascinating, very well designed. It's a beautiful book. I've looked at it before. I think you can get it at the airport. So book your ticket and come to Israel because tickets are cheaper than ever. And I think you can change the date as much as you want. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Yerushalayim, Israel is happening now. And we are seeing these nevuot coming to life. Come to Eretz Yisrael, learn the Nevi'im, open your eyes so you can see it happening. And the beautiful way that Micha ends is quoted in several different tefillot. Some also use this in Tashlich, which kind of reminds us of Yonah, because we're talking about fish and the ocean, and you go between Rosh Hashana to Yom Kippur to a spring, Mayim Chaim, with fish, and you throw breadcrumbs into the water, and you say, מי אל כמוך נושא עוון ועובר על פשע, לשארית נחלתו, לא החזיק לעד אפו כי חפץ חסד הוא. We say that God is benevolent, but God is mighty, God is powerful, and not be angry at us forever, and to finally bless us, and we are seeing what is happening now. Yashuv yirachamenu yichbosh avonotenu. God will come back and have mercy on us, and to get rid of all of our avonot, our iniquities. V'tashlich b'mtzulot yam kol chatotam. And all of our sins are going to be tossed into the ocean, and we're going to become meaningless, eaten up like fish food by the fish. So that's a beautiful way to end. Titen emet leYaakov chesed leAvraham asher nishbata la'avotenu mimei kedem. We are seeing a full circle coming back to the emet, which has to do with the way that the avot conduct themselves morally, and to come and to emulate them and to live that life in Eretz Yisrael. Thank you so much for watching this episode. We're almost getting there. We're almost at the end. I hope you've been enjoying this journey. Make sure to hit that like button and share this video, subscribe, comment, tell your friends about it, and I will see you on the next one.